And probably the best place to start is with a round of introductions. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself and what's your involvement with AI in education?
Of course, yes. So I've been working in education basically since I graduated from my undergrad. 10 years of that was within higher education, specifically in roles related to learning design, learning technology, and academic development. Since then, I worked for the Open Data Institute, a non-profit research institute focused on shock open data. I worked within a learning function there, so very much on the public engagement piece. Part of the work that we were doing there was into how we can maximize capabilities for data and indeed AI. Now I work at Multiverse, uh, it's an ed tech company, but by and large we provide apprenticeship programs in the data and digital space. So I'm the technical curriculum lead for data science. So I oversee the overarching curricula for those data programs.
All right, brilliant. And so that will be a range of expertise that we can draw on for the different aspects of today's topic. To ground the conversation, I'd like to first start by asking, what do you call AI?
Yeah, good question. Um, it's kind of grown a lot, I suppose. I mean, originally talking about AI, to be honest, simplified it right down to more the machine learning aspects, where it's heavily structured. The outputs are somewhat predictable when it comes to the explainability, the interpretability. You know what we're talking about, complex decision trees, for the most part. Um, as kind of the LLM sphere has grown considerably, I mean, AI has kind of become the catch-all for anything remotely automated with some level of data interpretation sitting within it. So it's quite a broad set. I think it is a catch-all. If I was being pedantic, then I'd get into the kind of rough and tumble of the specific systems. But put simply, I think anything where there is a level of automation with data-driven decision making that has either been designed ahead of time or is designed on the fly. Um, I would put exceptions within that, but I think as a broad capture for most people, I think that would work.
Uh-huh. Okay. And when you say automated decision making, does that mean taking actions or like just getting a decision or something that can be acted upon, but not necessarily by the AI?
I'd say both. I think then it comes back to implementation, organizational kind of considerations. Where do you sit in terms of risk appetite? So I think for the low level activities, then you know what, we're all quite happy to just see something happen and the system can figure it out. Um, for other things, certainly within the education sphere, is there if there is a direct impact on the progression of learners or their kind of uh, lives or anything that could be encapsulated under duty of care, then I think there's the human in the loop element. Um, that being said, that line kind of blurs if we're looking at kind of formative assessment versus summative assessment as an example of using AI to grade and provide feedback.
Okay, but either way, each would be AI still.
Yeah.
So that helps to clarify the boundary. And putting AI on a shelf for now, have you got any experience with open education?
Yes. So I've been kind of by and large, to the best of my abilities, an open practitioner since I joined the higher ed world. I think parts of the benefits of working within higher education, certainly within the learning side of higher education, is that there is a huge amount of open practice anyway. It's very collegiate. Um, I think although there is a huge amount of research in the area, there's also a huge amount of professional service kind of practice in the area. So I think there is a level of distinction in the more traditional academic sense of the kind of circles that people run in. But yes, in terms of sharing materials, making sure that they are completely openly licensed, ensuring that any kind of tools, systems, views, materials for conferences, all the like, basically anything that I do, unless specifically told to hide it, is done so under kind of an open sharing kind of mindset.
Okay. So that gets a few aspects of it. You mentioned open practice, open sharing, and open licensing, and that it's a mindset. Is there a link between all the different, like, here aspects of openness that is core to what open means here?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a general sense, it's a complete lack of ego. It can be, I've had an interesting experience and I think this might be of use to somebody. Setting aside whether it is useful in that they are able to apply it or useful in that they are able to rip you to shreds and tell you why you're wrong requires a particular personality. I think the other elements, things like open licensing, they're kind of the practical side of openness and the ways in which we somewhat protect ourselves, the way in which we communicate what we're doing. But by and large, I think the practice of openness in a general sense is the ability to share regardless of what the return conversation might be, positive, negative, neutral, completely nonchalant, not caring. There's all of that area of response.
Interesting. Okay. So it's openness is all about sharing. And taking that and taking back AI as a system that to some extent makes decisions based on data and putting those together, how might we define openness in the context of AI in education?
I think there's several different lenses that I would take that away and consider. I mean, fundamentally, if you look at all the LLM growth over the last few years, we're not talking about democratization uh, of representation. We're talking about democratization of access. Great, the tools are there, but we've got to have a consideration for what data these systems have been trained on. Now, different people will have their own views of good, bad, whatever, but fundamentally, if we want better systems, and I'll leave the definition of better kind of to one side, there needs to be a level of openness in the data that we have available and how we share that with others to help support a broader capture within these AI systems. So, set aside the personal GDPR data protection stuff and just talk more generally. What data do we have? What standards are we following? What schemas are we following? What systems by which we share are we following? How are we ensuring that data is available for other people to use? There's a perfect example in things like Transport for London. They share all of their system details completely openly, and then all of the other tools, platforms, systems get to come in, and companies build their Google Maps, City Map, all that jazz. The more niche train watching apps, great. They all benefit from this data set, but it's heavily structured, it's heavily available, and it has no cost. So, all right, TfL spend £1 million on it, but they get 4 million back. Benefit to the economy is 130 million. So if you want to quantify it, you've got those specific values. But if we're talking about that, then in the context of OpenAI, great, we're releasing these tools. The tools are there to be used. But even if we're talking about the limitation on the democratization of representation, there are voices that will have a kind of blasé attitude to that. There are voices that will heavily focus in on the morality of kind of data ethics in that moral conversation rather than the practical sense. But fundamentally, it's how can we ensure that the data that is available, that we continue to retrain these models on, is pragmatic, broadly applicable, and actually they're ready to be used. So having that explainability of what these data sets are, where they've come from, so we can build that level of context awareness as well. That's a very long answer. So I'll pause and just hand it back to you on any follow-up.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess AI systems are inextricably linked to the data that they have been trained on. Or do you also mean any other parts of data within the ecosystem?
I mean, it's all of it, isn't it, really? I think when we get into it, yes, there's the training element, but then there's also the what are the data sets that you're reviewing before you engage with the LLM? What are you throwing in it as part of your prompts? All of that element of practice. And when it comes to, that broader set of openness, what are we doing in the capabilities side? There's umpteen different courses that you can do around prompt engineering. Great, but within our individual context, what's the best way to get the right stuff out of it? What do we actually want to put in that's going to give us the most positive return? How are we going to offset some of the limitations in the data sets of which it's been trained on? So there's all those kind of segments. There's the actual technical openness, but there's the openness in regards to development and actual practical capability. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to do it? How are you going to make sure that you are, comfortable either in yourself or in your organizational view of how you use these tools as well?
Okay. And coming back to the example of Transport for London, which you mentioned, they're a platform sharing data openly. Um, but in a similar way, can you think of any examples of AI technologies that you would call open AI?
Uh, no, not necessarily. I mean, I suppose it depends what. Unfortunately, you said open AI, in which case it immediately links you to ChatGPT. In which case, the idea of openness by and large is a little bit, rubbish, in my personal view. And that's not necessarily that the information isn't there. There are plenty of there's a blog on Wolfram that kind of gives you a full in-depth explanation as to exactly how these systems are working and how the probability factor plays in when it's generating a response. So the explainable system is there. Exactly whether everybody has I got about halfway through it and was like, okay, great. I can't remember a blooming thing. So there is a capability there that I think there's a gap. And just on the basis of those data skills, whatever we refer to as openness within the AI space does become a little bit limiting. Because I think within the practices of sharing and people sharing best practice, and there's lots of good voices across the web, within the ecosystems of education, within the ecosystems of higher ed globally and other organizations. But fundamentally, it's kind of operating either at a base level of how can we use the tools, or it's operating on we need a full on technical understanding of how these things work. And there's just that bit in the middle that's missing. So it's not to say that you can't get examples of open AI. I just think the definition of open AI, to your point at the start, not looking to define it with a minutia of accurate definition, but I think there are many definitions, and I think that's part of where the complexity starts to come in. So would I say specific examples? I don't think I'd be confident to put my name to any specific examples of openness within the AI sphere.
But then, okay, if there are many different aspects to openness, bringing it back a little bit to what openness meant in the context of education, you mentioned it was all about being open to sharing through different practices. And so I'm seeing that from the perspective of the person who is sharing the data or sharing the system. It's as if then it would be openness from an institution, a person, a company who are releasing an AI system that would make it open or not in the way that it's shared. Um, I guess from whose perspective can something be open or not?
I mean, I think quite frankly, it's the argument, isn't it? It's there. I can sit here and say I am an open practitioner. Other people will turn around and say, no, you're not. When it comes to the tools that we provide, what, there was an interesting exchange I saw on a LinkedIn post, which was a discussion of equity of access. And one of the immediate comment replies was, really, within the university sphere, when there's such a heavy cost of going to university in many countries, not every institution, I appreciate. But if you're putting in those kind of financial blocks for people to access education, by and large, that equity of access within your sphere is great. We'll just pass the book of closed to a different process. Who's to decide what's open? I think it comes down to the spectrum of openness. I used to work at the ODI, and they talk about openness as a spectrum, and they talk about it specifically as it relates to data sets when we're getting into the practical sense. But I think at this next level of who decides, I think you've got to accept that it is a spectrum of openness, and not everything needs to be truly open, but there is elements that we can share that support openness. And also, not everything should be open. There are bits that fundamentally should remain behind a closed door for X, Y, and Z reasons, whether that's GDPR compliance or other things, risk appetites and so on, potential impact, negative impact towards people. I think it's a discussion to be had, and I think an ongoing debate.
Interesting. And so if we think of an ideal system that is not perhaps 100% open kind of thing, but somewhere in the good middle ground. When now thinking about it, in a hypothetical sense, since you mentioned maybe there aren't any examples at the moment of systems you'd call fully open, but if one did exist, what characteristics or aspects would it have that would make it open?
I suppose it depends what it is that you're trying to. It is heavily context dependent. So if you give an example of it, it was a piece of work that the ODI is continuing to do. They started whilst I was there, in conjunction with the Open University, to build a RAG system that can be more context aware, so we can have an overlaying LLM chatbot that's feeding in off the learning content that exists across an entire program. Now, the system that was being built is going to be released openly. It's already available on GitHub. People can go and look at the system as it's in progress. In terms of the LLM, the foundational model that it is actually plugging into, that's left quite open, so people can plug in whichever one they've subscribed to. Now, you've already got that limitation of openness there immediately. So although the system, overarching system, is available, is open, you've immediately reduced the ability for people to use it because of that link directly to a foundational model. When it comes then to the content to which it's being trained, well, depends who picks it up and how they're going to use it. There's lots of worry about IP, but then if we're looking at the educational sense, I mean, I think the best quote the best comment I've ever had that I will continue to requote is it was from a post 92 university, and it's like, we still do research led teaching, it's just not our research. And anybody who sits there and kind of suggests that undergrad education is by and large, it's the baseline level to get people to the next step, all of that stuff is public and available. So if we start limiting the IP of our learning materials and the content to which we train and use these models, then we're putting in blocks. There probably needs to be a serious conversation around, it's your IP is fine. The textbook that you and several other universities are using and have designed your course against, by and large, is available if people want it. So maybe don't worry. But I think it is that context. Can we release the tool? Yeah, we can. Are we going to release the content? Maybe not. Are we going to release the foundational models and the systems by which we need to drive these further? Again, maybe not. So I think that example of openness from ODI and OU's perspective, great, fantastic. I think that is a glowing example of open practice out in the world. But it is limited by the work that they can do around the edges, on that link to the foundational model, on the reticence around sharing learning content.
Uh-huh. Okay. So that kind of gives us an example and also gives ideas for a future where what a more open system would look like. So I'd like to ask, why might we want that? What are the potential benefits of using open AI technologies in education?
I think fundamentally it comes down to maximizing the positive impact. Um, we know there's risks. We know there's potential for harm. There is with everything. Now, some people are going to have that they're going to be more risk averse, and some people are going to be far less and quite happy to utilize these tools. If we are open in our practice, if we are open in sharing what has worked and sharing what hasn't, fundamentally everybody learns. When we look at educational research more generally, there's a huge amount of action research projects and it's small amounts of numbers. And then you wait for the meta analysis to come out and you wait for the meta analysis to come out. And suddenly you have something that's generalized. Great. It all ends up being a bit of inception. But if we can start sharing those practices, what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, we all benefit and we can all learn something from it. I think where we take that further then is where we look at the data that we as educational institutions of all types hold. We work toward a shared understanding of what those data sets are, what the hardline limitations might be, and get some level of agreement, not necessarily a formal agreement, but some level of agreement of what is to be used, what isn't to be used, and how we apply these practices. I mean, fundamentally, the HE sector, yes, it's non-profit within the UK anyway. There are private institutions, but there is a level of competition. They're all trying to entice. So there's going to be different mechanisms by which these tools are used. But at a baseline, we can set a standard, utilize open standards, look at data schemas so we can share information and share systems between each other and set a good baseline. I think when that open practice comes in, specifically around open AI, it is the research elements, it is the systems we use, it is the way we structure the data, and ultimately kind of how we do the change management piece of the explainability and interpretability, how we upskill on capabilities, how we share those practices and actually get people um, to be more confident so we can relay any of the fears when it comes to any risk aversion. But also, pragmatically, I think a lot of people, when it comes to data ethics, if you're against it, those voices are very much on the it's armchair ethicists, it's morality police, it's people putting their views out. And those views are fundamentally kind of they talk about what data ethics shouldn't be, but they don't talk about what it should be. And what it should be is a set of practical skills that we can apply to evaluate the impacts. But what decision you make, right or wrong, beyond that, whether you go forward, whether you stop, fine, that's for yourself. But the capabilities that we should look to develop within all of this openness of sharing, within all of this openness of licensing of systems, is the capability to go, I can evaluate the potential and I can put the reasonable lessons out there for other people to utilize as well.
Ah, I see. Thanks for sharing. I'm noticing we're coming to the end of our half hour. Do you still have 10 minutes or do you need to go?
No, I've got time, don't worry.
Okay. In that case, I'd like to ask, as you've alluded to, our understanding is constantly changing as everyone's learning. Are there any emerging trends or developments that you believe will shape or influence the future of openness in AI?
Um, that's a really good question. I think because of the role that I'm in, because of the practice that I undertake kind of professionally, there is the slightly more technical mindset of it all. Um, I work with a lot of machine learning engineers. I work with a lot of data specialists. I work with industry leaders to kind of understand what our curriculum should be. And I would kind of bring it down. I think where the emerging trends come, LLMs are going to exist. They're going to get better. fantastic. And I think that's where people see the kind of practicality of easy to use tools come through. I think actually what we will see is more of those structured subsets of AI coming out as well and aligning to those practices. So I think that's where we're going to get more machine learning, and we're going to get, quite frankly, simplistic systems, but they're going to be robust, and they're going to take all of that investment in data infrastructure and push forward really strong models that enable us to be much more efficient, much more effective. And I think that's going to happen in all kind of process driven aspects of our job roles. There was a wonderful paper back in, I think, was it 2017? So certainly within my area, and it basically just talks around technology enhanced learning. So what is it? And the three subsections they come out with is it has a genuine benefit to education. Technology, that is, actually enhances the learning that takes place. Technology increases the quantitative measures by which people perform, i.e. they do better. We see that in their grades. And the third one was administrative function. And I think if we throw things like AI, things like machine learning into that kind of categorization of technology enhanced learning, we're going to see the administrative pieces come out massively in favor. I think we're going to see lots in the way of context aware chatbots within learning systems that can point people toward really good pieces of content that enable them to build up and go back and return if they're kind of not quite there. I was playing around with O'Reilly, so the big publisher. They've got a really nice system because they've got so much stuff. You throw in what you want to learn and it gives you just a nice overview of these things and links you out to all of the textbooks and activities. It's a really good system. Regardless of what you think of O'Reilly, it's a publisher. They've got a lot. Now, that's not always going to be the case for everybody. And I think that's kind of an element to keep in mind. But in terms of what we're seeing coming through, I think the usage of AI tools in LLM formats are going to become much more specific in their focus rather than just the ChatGPT's there, go and ask it a question. Here's how you write some prompts. I think it's going to be much more direct, and it's going to be designed with the prompts within it. And I think actually under the hood, where a lot of people aren't necessarily as aware, there's going to be a huge amount of work on the kind of process driven machine learning aspects that make life a lot easier.
So I guess to recap, we started off with open sharing of things being sort of an open-mindedness of sharing without caring or without worrying about how people will react. And we got to different people will have different perspectives on whether something's being shared openly or not, because it differs how much use they can make of it or to what extent it's being openly shared with them.
Yeah.
Right. And now we're talking about systems becoming more robust and easier to use and more effective in that now they're being more openly shared with the people trying to use them. So in that sense, that's a link between openness that I see with the trends. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what challenges have you encountered or do you foresee in implementing specifically open AI in education?
You know what? I'll start off with a really simple example, and I think it speaks to a bigger issue around reticence and risk and ownership. And this is when we talk about open licensing as a practical communication tool. Non-commerciality clauses absolutely kills me when I see people talking about open education and open practice and then throwing a NC license on it. And that's not to say that I don't think the non-commerciality clauses, I think they're right to have, and I think they're right to use in certain circumstances. But when we see it on frameworks to support practices, when we see it on actual practical tools that enable us to implement things further, what we see within those frameworks then is that you've done all the work to produce this framework. but we're limiting the ability for it to grow. And we're limiting the ability for it to grow because we're putting that hardline commerciality clause in. And when it comes to other organizations who might take it away and might use it as part of a consultancy piece, we will see variations coming through and we'll see those taken further. I think retaining the share alike and the attribution is vitally important. But I think as soon as you start to put the limitations on those practices, if we're sharing stuff in the open, it should be in the open. Again, there's the spectrum. Not everything needs to be open, and some things should be protected from various actors. But what I would love to see is that change management piece, and a lot of that change management comes from the tools and the frameworks that we put out in the world for people to utilize to progress their own practice. The more we can do that, and the more openly we can make those available, the more we see development, the more we see development in the tools, development in the capabilities, development in the thought process that underpin it, and fundamentally then development in the end goal, openness within AI, the tools, the systems, the practical features we put out in the world. I think within that then and that framing, the biggest challenge is the capabilities. It's the understanding. It's the actually getting people in a place where they can apply the practical skills. So the data ethics comment I made, it's not about discussing right and wrong. That is part of it. But data ethics is a practice about evaluating the potential impacts. What you decide about those impacts is for you to decide. But the practical skills are where it's so important. And when we're talking about openness in AI, then it is again the capabilities, the practical skills, the ability to evaluate our opportunities and then make a decision on what it is. And I think if we can get over that piece, subside some of that risk aversion, and focus on the benefits, but also recognize there are major harms, major potential harms. Be open to the fact that things can indeed go wrong, but also what are we going to do about those things? I think that's also an important piece. Just because things can go wrong doesn't mean that they will, and doesn't mean that you shouldn't do things. But relaying those fears again comes back to capabilities, comes back to understanding. So I think within all of that, the biggest piece that we should focus on is the development and the learning available to people to develop their own understanding of what the potential is across the board. And I think from that, then we start to see the kind of change that we'd like, the change toward openness, toward making practices, sharing practices, developing and publishing openly. And when I say practices, I mean kind of the whole spread of stuff, whether that is experience, whether that is materials, whether that is indeed systems as well.
Right. And when you mentioned risks, thinking specifically, what risks do you associate with the use of open AI in education?
I mean, the big one's going to be kind of duty of care. We're all practitioners that oversee the academic progress of our learners, but also the pastoral progress of our learners. There is a duty of care. So I think the big risk that people come back to is harm against the people that we serve through education. Also kind of risk of impact against colleagues. But if you then get up to the kind of institutional levels, then you've got the reputational, you've got the commercial, you've got the legal. There's a huge amount around things like GDPR that people don't understand. The whole argument of it, it's not your data. Stop calling it your data. It's data about you. When it comes to lawful basis, then consent for a lot of things just isn't used because it isn't relevant, because we've gone through things like legitimate interest, or we've gone to public task. That data is getting shared and it is being used for lots of reasons. Consent, by and large, relegated to marketing. And even then, not always, depending on the framing and the way in which you kind of apply those practices. When it comes to the risk, I think the biggest ones are the reputational and the legal. Reputational from an organizational perspective, legal from an individual perspective. Nobody wants to get in trouble. And I think wrapped up in all of that then is the potential harms against individuals not wanting to impact one person, many people, a group of people. And again, I think that comes under the capability bucket of let's show you how to evaluate that and make a decision based on that evaluation rather than sitting in the potential of things going wrong.
So I guess such risks would apply to AI systems in education as a whole, but bringing it back to the open piece, would it then be linked because with openly shared AI systems, more people are able to use them, so the use is more widespread? Or is there anything different about open systems?
I think that again comes into context. So if you've got democratization of access, then yes, absolutely, there's potential for greater risks. If somebody publishes a tool and we all start using it, but we don't know what it's been trained on, we don't know what sits under the surface, we don't know what we're potentially sharing with it, then that in and of itself is a risk. If we're looking at data that we share, then it comes back to the GDPR element. How can we anonymize data appropriately in order to maximize the value of a data set that we share? Hugely important, certainly within the research sphere, and all of the systems that the data sets that would go into these systems. So there's a consideration around that. And actually, if we can maximize the available data, good quality data, we kind of offset some of the risks around representation of the outputs and ensuring that they are accurate. When we look at the maintenance as well, it's not just about putting tools out there, actually understanding what is happening under the hood to make sure that they are maintained, sustainably implemented, being monitored for things like degradation and so on. So there's all those kind of technical aspects that come into it as well. I don't think openness is just about the availability for tools to be used. I think it's about the understanding and the transparency of how the tools are being managed, maintained, appropriately monitored, and also trained. So there's the data sets, there's the system, there's the practices. And I think if we separate out the level of openness and accept that there are different definitions of openness across those three very generalized areas, I think that's kind of where it starts to come through. So what do we mean by openness in data? What do we mean by openness in the systems? And what do we mean by openness in the end user perspective?
I see. And I guess we've already alluded to quite a few things that are barriers that we would need to address. So I guess there's upskilling of the skills that people need. There's legal challenges to figure out. And there's sort of an in-progress trend of democratizing access. But are there any steps you think are necessary to promote openness in AI education so it goes in the right direction going forward?
Yes, I think that's, I suppose it's unfortunate, isn't it? Because these systems have been put out there and a huge amount of kind of backlash immediately of, you know what, people are using this for their assessments and isn't it all dangerous and people aren't doing their work anymore? And, I'm being facetious with that, but it is a fear. But then it's also a case of a lot of those fears can be mitigated with good assessment design by reverting to the pedagogical practice and exploring how courses are designed and delivered and assessed. A lot of it does just come down to, I think, the change management piece and how we can get people involved. So, if we're working on it in the education space, then cool. Well, how put those working groups together of how we're going to implement institutional policy or practices to embed these systems within our teaching and learning practice. When we look at the data sets, then actually do the kind of conversations. What are the data sets that are important? There's a huge amount of work that went into learning analytics. Did it tell us anything more than attendance? Great, attendance and scores, that's by and large where it sits, but we've got all of this data. So where can we make use of those things? When it comes to the submissions and the work that we've had year on year, what can we do with those elements of pieces, and what can we do to kind of support growth in our development of courses, growth in our feedback to learners and personalization. I think it is just a whole case of we need to get people involved, and we need to get people involved in all of the aspects that cover their job roles. It's not just about, I spoke about admin before, and yes, there's a lot of it that's going to make our lives a lot easier and a lot more efficient. But if you're using these and you're interacting with people, students, learners, whatever, colleagues, where we're looking then is, what do you actually need? What does this mean for your research? What does this mean for your admin? What does it mean for your teaching? What does it mean for your course design? What does it mean for all of these different aspects? And I think rather than just throwing, hey, AI is going to make life easier, it is kind of the focus on those specific elements of how you can use it across the board and how it's going to benefit across the board, and getting people involved in the room as well. I think it is fundamentally just one big, massive change management process. The unfortunate nature of that is that we don't have the control over the systems that have been released on the web. So anybody can go and set up a ChatGPT account and just crack on and make use. I think that people just need to relinquish a little bit of control and get involved. Yeah, it's quite a long, blathering answer. I appreciate. I apologize. It was
That's really interesting.
started
No,
and went
thank
on.
you for sharing.
That's all
Like,
right.
there's a lot of questions of how to be answered, and yeah, getting people to the table is a good starting point.
Yeah, and this is it, isn't it? And it's all well and good, isn't it, saying get people to the table. There is a huge amount of practical element there, but we've seen a huge amount of growth in a short space of time, and quite frankly, have people had the time to fully? I mean, yes, there's researchers in this space who have kept their eye on the ball, and people within kind of digital education more generally have the appropriate kinds of roles to apply time to this. But that's not everybody. That's not most people. Most people within the education sphere are doing their job, and they're doing it in and around this ecosystem of all these tools being released. Have they actually had the most appropriate time to explore them, try them, learn from them, and upskill themselves? No, probably not. Huge growth, short space of time, massive impact then for people to try and catch up, which, I mean, I don't want to be the person in charge of the operations of any large organization when you turn around and say, hey, these people need some time off of their actual jobs to just go and learn some stuff. It's difficult, really difficult.
Mhm. Yeah, I suppose getting more input hides a lot of the complexity of actually doing that in real life.
Yeah. And it's, you know what, you do the working groups, don't you? And it all relies on networks and who you know and what you know. But is that everybody? Is that everybody who has a voice that's useful in these pieces? No, but also what you're going to do. It is what it is in a lot of sense, which is a shame, but is also a fact of life.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. As
That's
we
all right.
wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss about the use or future of open AI technologies in education that we haven't covered?
Uh, no, I think we've covered a good amount of ground. I mean, we've covered the capabilities bit, we've covered the systems, we've covered the risks, we've covered promotion of. Yeah, no, I'm happy with what I've said, even if it has been a little bit long-winded at times.
All right. So we'll wrap it up here. And I guess let's see what happens in a few months' time as our understanding and available systems change.
Absolutely. But thank you ever so much for this. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. It's lovely to meet you as well.
Likewise. Stop the recording here.